When you build something like a bridge or a skyscraper, in order to test its strength, you simulate like a terrible earthquake or a hurricane, because only by something so drastic can you see the faults and the cracks in the structure that you've designed. And these kind of crises reveal the potential problems in our political structures, in our individual lives. So we're being tested in a way, because facing something so large and so immediate and so drastic, it naturally feeds our irrational tendencies.
Unlike, say, 20, 30 years ago, now, literally, we can pop on Instagram and you can always find someone that's better looking than you, has more money than you, has a better relationship with you, a better girlfriend or boyfriend. Talk to me about how we can maybe break the cycle or even recognize that this cycle is happening.
Your career, your power, your success in life depends on your ability to bring out your uniqueness. That's your source of power. If you're constantly thinking about what other people have, take these qualities and turn them around. Feel grateful for who you are. People in the 21st century, we have a lot of anxiety. And that anxiety stems from this one thing that we're not confronting, which is our own mortality. It's the most real thing in your future. That awareness makes you suck every second of life with more intensity, more vitality, more awareness, more gratitude, because it can be taken away at any moment. Being irrational is very dangerous. It's like a vapor that's hidden. You don't realize that it's infecting your decisions, but it is. And just being aware of how subtly it's infecting everything that you do can give you the ability to be more rational in life.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Robert Greene, the American best-selling author on strategy, power, and seduction. You have written 6 international bestsellers, including The 48 Laws of Power, The 50th Law, co-authored with rapper 50 Cent, and Mastery. The 48 Laws of Power has been widely referenced in pop culture, including songs by Jay-Z and Kanye West, and is currently being adapted into a documentary series by the rapper Drake. The book is known worldwide and is also one of the most requested titles in American prison libraries. Your work has also been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, and Forbes. And your latest book, The Laws of Human Nature, explores the principles that govern our behavior and how to use this knowledge for continuous self-improvement. Robert, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you for having me, Brian. My pleasure.
It's great to have you. It's been almost 8 years since we had you on the first time. It was the old studio. I think we kind of split the screens. It was really old school, but I still remember that conversation, Robert. It was epic, and
It was fun. It was fun.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I wish I was there in London now. But what can we do? It's the circumstances we're all facing. But
yeah, well, hopefully in time, either I'll get to LA or we'll get you to London to do that again. But remember last time we went way off topic, and it was just really good. I just checked it. It's got like 100,000 views, so it did pretty well. And yeah, I mean, I'd love to jump into the book, but first I'm wondering, what did you learn about human nature watching the world for the last 3 months and the whole, COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, everything? What have you seen?
Well, a lot of things that I wrote about in the book have been confirmed. The first chapter in the Laws of Human Nature, law number 1, is about irrationality. And the idea is that we like to think of us human beings as being supremely rational, that our behavior is governed by our minds, by our intelligence, that we think before we act. And I try to make the point in the book, I try to hit you over the head with this idea that that's not true at all, that we're basically governed by emotions. And I explain the neuroscience behind that, how emotions are much more powerful physically than anything that our neocortex can supply to counter that. So basically, we think that our decisions are based on thinking, but they're based on our emotional responses to events. And the coronavirus is kind of a laboratory of that kind of phenomenon, because facing something so large and so immediate and so drastic, it naturally feeds our irrational tendencies. And we see that in obvious behavior, which, at least in the United States, with the hoarding of toilet paper, of hand sanitizers, of things like that, that kind of behavior was completely irrational. What was that based on? But also, people have, at least here, they have a hard time figuring out what the future is going to be. And so the fear response is very real. We have to, realize that this threat is dangerous, and that the coronavirus is something very real. But what are the long-term consequences on our thinking patterns? How is this fear going to become like a habit? How is this going to infiltrate our career decisions moving forward? You know, so that's one sort of thing that is definitely brought out. And it's asking. We're an intensely social animal. Our survival, I make this point in the book, depends on our ability to get along with other people and to understand their point of view, etc. And a virus like this is putting a big kind of strain on that, because what it means is, by following certain guidelines that have been put out by people who study this, scientists who actually have a more rational take on what's actually going on, like epidemiologists, the pro-social thing is to protect other people as well. So it's not just about you taking, certain steps to protect yourself, but it's also helping other people. So in some sense, there's been some positive elements, at least in parts of the states where I live, where most people are following these rules and they're thinking about other people. But there's a lot of very selfish behavior and people kind of going crazy and getting very restless about the lockdown. I often think about World War II, and in the States and certainly in Britain, of the incredible sacrifices that we were asked to make for those events, economically, personally, with our freedoms, etc. And that how people back then, there were maybe even some grumbling, but people back then were more than willing to make those sacrifices. And I'm wondering if it's the same situation now, because you're seeing people are so restless. They have to get out. They have to have their life as it was before. And if we see a second wave of this again, as might be happening right now in the United States, that means that we're not willing to make those kind of we can't even take 3 or 4 months to stay alone in our apartments or our houses to sort of let this pass over. This is another element of human nature that I sort of discuss in the book.
Just that thought of sacrifice, you're saying, or being alone. Which one do you mean? Sacrifice or just being alone with your thoughts?
Well, both. I mean, in theory, this could be a moment of great opportunity for people, because most of the time in our day-to-day lives, we're so rushed. We don't have any time to think about ourselves, to think about our careers, to think about ourselves, about who we are. We don't really have time to read books. Life just comes at us so rapidly. And here now, we have the ability to finally look at ourselves and introspect a little bit and think about who we are, think about our career, the point we are in life, to read books, to strengthen ourselves from within. Because some of these life skills, the ability, for instance, to delay instant gratification. So you can't go out to a pub, you can't get drunk, etc. But you can find pleasures and distractions in other ways. And in doing that, you build a kind of inner strength that will last long after this coronavirus is gone. You'll be able to be more patient. You'll be able to withstand moments where you do have to be alone, where you do have to think, where you do have to think about yourself and what you want and what your likes and dislikes are. So the ability to be alone and to kind of reflect is a very important life skill, you know, and not just be constantly on social media, etc., and sort of have some sense of who you are as differentiating yourself from the crowd. So these are moments where you could develop true life skills. And that is a bit of a sacrifice because, you know, you're not used to having to do that in your day-to-day life, and this is sort of forcing you on it. But I want people to think of that as an actual opportunity to kind of build internal strength.
Yeah, I kept thinking, because, you know, we're in London, we're in East London, and I kept thinking of 1940 Battle of Britain. I mean, this place was being bombed, you know, on a nightly basis. People were having to sacrifice and be rationed, and they thought maybe the Germans were going to come to the shores, and they were preparing for that. So for me, I'm always, when the lockdown hit and the pandemic, I just tried to compare it with something this city went through, you know, 80 years ago, and it never seemed that bad, even though it was different because it was this invisible thing. But I always tried to use that to ground me while I've been here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and the public spirit, I mean, you know, it is a little bit of a cliche in all the movies that they have about this, particularly at certain holidays in England, but there was definitely an incredible spirit that came up, a sort of a social spirit of we're in this together, we're united, and we're going to defeat this enemy. It's a lot harder with something that's not we can't personify. It's not a living thing. It's not something that we can say this is the enemy and we're going to destroy it. It's much more diabolical than that in a way. And so in that sense, it's a little more difficult than if we were facing an actual invasion. But to think of it as something that can test our ability to unify, to think of other people, to be pro-social, to think in terms of what is the greater good for our country, for the whole country, not just the wealthy, but everybody in all classes, et cetera. You know, these kinds of crises, you know, when you build something like a bridge or a skyscraper, in order to test its strength, you simulate like a terrible earthquake or a hurricane, because only by something so drastic can you see the faults and the cracks in the structure that you've designed. And these kind of crises reveal the faults in the structures and the gaps and the potential problems in our political structures, in our individual lives, and how strong we are. So we're being tested in a way. And that's sort of how I like to look at it. In some ways, there's good news, and in some ways, there's bad news, at least here in the United States.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at it. And I'll be honest, a lot has been revealed to us here in the last 3 months when it comes to what really happens, what the structures are like. Some has been good, some has been bad, but it's all been a great opportunity for us to learn and grow and get better, to say the least. Robert, I just had a question that I just thought of. You know, you talk in the book a lot about empathy and trying to understand the other, and, you know, as an antidote potentially to narcissism. I'm wondering, you know, we're seeing a lot of division in America, and at the same time, we can't interact socially. So we miss the cues and the get-togethers and times where we maybe would hang out socially, even with people with different points of view. And now we watch our own news networks, we follow our own social people, we sometimes interact digitally, which means we lose the nuance, we use the empathy, we use the humanity of it. Do you see this extended lockdown period being difficult or hard for that empathy factor?
Very much so. But in moments like this, what really is important is leadership, is somebody on the top sort of setting the tone for the entire country. And we've noticed that, you know, at least here in the United States, we faced moments like this before. Probably the most extreme was during the Civil War. And when the person or the people on top are basically trying to spread a message of, we have to unify this country, we're all in this together, we're all Americans, at least for the United States here. And we're either going to, you know, a house divided cannot stand, which were Lincoln's very famous words. You know, it's either, so that kind of people from the top can set the tone. But when you have leadership actually trying to divide us, actually pushing all of our buttons, becomes increasingly difficult. And so I've noticed on social media, I'm not going to disguise the fact that I am not a Trump supporter. I do not like Donald Trump. I think he's the worst president we've ever had, and he's extremely dangerous. I'm not going to hide that. So people can take that and however they want. But I've noticed on social media that I try and discuss rationally on Facebook or wherever, certain elements of certain of his policies, particularly now since the coronavirus has exploded on us. And I don't get like, I'm open to other people. I'm trying to hear their point of view. I'm trying to hear them defend his response to a crisis that has killed over 120,000 Americans. The equivalent of over 50 9/11s, if you will, kind of thing, or 60 9/11s. An incredible number of private citizens being killed. I want to hear their defense. I'm open to hearing something rational. And all I get are these slogans and this very kind of defensive posture. And it sort of starts from the top. He's kind of created this tone. Of course, he's exploiting something that's already there. He's already exploiting the divisions that exist within our country, and he's making them worse. And he's using social media as a way to do this. But it doesn't mean that social media in itself is simply a means of dividing people. It could be used for other things. It could be used as a form of dialogue. It could be used as a way of rational discourse. I know I'm sounding like incredibly idealistic here, but I want to hear people defend his policies. I want to hear a rational argument. And all you get are these heated emotional responses. A lot of it to me stems from cognitive dissonance, which is something I talk about in the chapter on irrationality. And the idea here is you form an opinion about somebody. Let's say you support a certain politician like Donald Trump, and then evidence comes in that maybe contradicts your original decision. But you, instead of listening to that evidence, because if you listen to that and then you have to admit that you were wrong in your original choice, and people never like to admit that they were wrong. They would rather hold on to something that's irrational, to believe that their original choice was the right one, than to have to admit that their original choice was wrong, because it causes doubts about who you are, about yourself as a person and your own intelligence. So instead of rethinking your original position, you then latch on even more emotionally to what drove you in the first place. And I see a lot of that kind of behavior going on. And so one of the things I talk about in rationality, it's not that you're not born rational, you are born irrational, but to become irrational, to become rational, you have to be able at times to admit you are wrong, to admit that sometimes you made a mistake, that you made choices that didn't come from the right information. That is the first step towards becoming a rational human being. And I've done that through myself. I'm constantly admitting that predictions I made 8 or 10 years ago were wrong. People I voted for ended up not being the right people, and it was my fault. I recognize my own limitations, that I can make emotional, wrong-headed decisions. That is the first step towards being rational. And in this climate, it's extremely hard to find people who are willing to do that.
And what else can we do, Robert? I mean, I think most people would probably agree with you that we're irrational, even though we all like to think we make just logical decisions. But is there any other way of like checking your emotion on a regular basis, or when it comes to big decisions? I mean, we've all heard about the exercise where you write down the pros and cons of a decision, and when you see the two lists, then you make the decision. I mean, that's a way I think of trying to engineer out your emotions. But like, what are some other things that people can do either to recognize it or to be more rational?
Well, the first step is actually quite simple. And if you don't make this first step, none of the other things, writing that stuff on a piece of paper, will be meaningless. The first step is to understand that you are not rational, that emotions are infecting your decisions. So if you have a strategy, a plan for your company to make more money, or for yourself in your career, the first thing you have to do is you have to realize that 90% of what has gone into your decision is emotional, that you're basing it on wishes, on what you hope will be the truth, and that you're finding evidence to confirm that, confirmation bias. Okay, so if you can't make that first step, forget all the other bullshit that people throw at you in self-help books. It's meaningless. And I do a lot of consulting with business leaders, and I go through this time and time again. I try and say, look, your decision that you've just come upon is basically based on what you want, not on what's actually going to necessarily happen. So you have to take a step back and realize that. And when you realize that, now you reassess your decision. Okay, now you can begin to have what's called emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence basically means the ability to assess your own emotions. So if you feel angry or if you feel excited, instead of acting on it, instead of going out and buying 10,000 shares of that stock that other people are buying, or instead of like writing some really angry email to your boss about something he or she said, you then think about, why am I angry? Why am I excited? Is it reasonable? Is it based on what's actually happening to me right here in the present? Maybe it's not reasonable. Maybe I'm responding to something that happened in my childhood or to something that happened a few days ago, and it's not about what's going on in the present. So the ability to step back and analyze your own emotional responses is actually a critical life skill. And then when you're looking at your decision, you're making it a choice about your life. Let's say a lot of people now are facing a very big decision, which is, what is my future? What is my career going to mean? I may not have a job when this is over, or it might be a very different job, right? Okay. So you want to have the ability to step back and consider other options, because the greatest limitation that the human mind has is that we tend to consider what we've done in the past. We tend to follow a straight line. If we're considering, we're going to go here, here, or here, we only think of three possible paths in life. We have very narrow perspective. We try and keep this narrow because otherwise the human brain gets overloaded. You want to be able to expand your choices. You want to be able, instead of just thinking of A, B, and C, you want to think of D, E, and F, and G. You want to think, are there other things I could be doing? Are there other possibilities out there? I'm tending to always repeat the same strategies, the same conventional, boring ideas from the past, these sort of patterns of life. And I talk about the laws of human nature. 90% of our behavior is compulsive. We repeat the same patterns of behavior, the same strategies over and over and over again. It's the animal part of our nature. And to be truly intelligent, to be truly rational, to be able to break out of those patterns. But you can't do that unless your mind is willing to consider a wider range of possibilities for yourself or for your decision. So when you write down those pros and cons, you're probably not writing down all of them. You're probably keeping them narrowed down to a certain thing. And even if you do write those pros and cons, your emotions are going to infect what you write down as a pro and a con, unless you are aware of all these things that I'm talking about. So being irrational is very dangerous. It's like a vapor that's hidden. You don't realize that it's infecting your decisions, but it is. And just being aware of how subtly it's infecting everything that you do can give you the ability to be more rational in life.
Are there any ways to just disrupt your patterns of thinking? I mean, I think when you were here 8 years ago, I vaguely remember us talking about psychedelics. 2 years ago, I went and had some pretty heavy, I think we did. I had some big ayahuasca ceremonies in Costa Rica a couple years ago.
Oh, good for you.
And we made a movie about it called Reconnect. And I mean, talk about getting a reset for your brain and just opening up my brain to lots of possibilities. It definitely did. Of course, the integration process took a couple years. Some people say it's still happening. But like, are there other ways to just kind of detach from those patterns? Because Robert, otherwise we'll repeat them for the rest of our lives. And then, that's why a lot of people have these regrets, because they look back at their life and they see they were stuck in these patterns, right?
Well, everything that we talked about here so far this evening is all about awareness. That's the key thing here that I'm trying to pound into people in my book. You have the short version there, which is fine. I don't want to say don't read it, but the book, the actual book is long. I'm afraid it's like over 500 pages, and I'm pounding into your little head that you are not aware of yourself. You don't know yourself. You don't know other people. Okay, so the key here in going about your patterns is to be aware of those patterns. Okay, if you're not aware of those patterns, you will repeat them your entire life because you don't even know that they exist. So what are your patterns? So to do that, you have to take a step back and you have to introspect, which we were talking about earlier. You have to look at yourself, and the patterns that you'll see will be very evident in certain things. They'll be evident in certain career choices that you've made. You've noticed that you tend to go either for a job that gives you a lot of money because that's something that's important to you, and then you're unhappy and frustrated because it's not fulfilling. And then you go for another job for a lot of money, and then you're unhappy. And you start drinking, you start taking drugs, and you go for, on and on and on and on. Or look at your patterns and your decisions, important decisions. They reveal something about you. Look at your choices of intimate partners. A lot of people will make a wrong choice. I know I have in my life. Luckily, I've been with somebody now for several decades, and I've made it the right choice. But in the past, you'll notice that you often choose the wrong kind of person, the wrong man or woman for you. And then 3 years later, you repeat it. You don't realize it, but you're going for the same type of person. You're attracted to narcissistic man or woman. You break up, and then you go after the same person again, over and over and over again. These are patterns that are trying to tell you something about something deep within you, about your character, about something that goes back to your childhood. So I tell in the story, in the book, the famous kind of case study of psychiatrist, where there's this young man who keeps having these patterns of these relationships with women. He keeps breaking them off after a couple of years. And then he tells the therapist, well, she wasn't right. She wasn't my type, or blah, blah. He keeps coming up with reasons. And finally, the analyst discovers that essentially his relationship with his mother wasn't very loving to him when he was 3 years old. You know, she was kind of a narcissistic mother. And he always had this feeling of being abandoned by her. And it was very painful for him. But he doesn't remember it because it was when he was 3 or 4 years old. And so his pattern in life is to always be the one abandoning other people before they can abandon him, so he doesn't repeat that feeling of pain. But look at the incredible painful pattern it sets. He can never have a relationship, and he can never be aware of why he's doing that. Well, you can better believe that you out there listening to this have patterns like that. They may not be so extreme, but that you have patterns that stem from relationships with your father, your mother, your siblings, your earliest teachers, that are causing you to do things that you're not aware of. And you can only see evidence in this in certain very important decisions that you make that reveal something about your character, about your emotional resilience or your lack of it. As I said, in relationships or career decisions, and there might be other areas as well. So seeing those patterns, you now have the ability to perhaps break. It's not easy. It's not going to be a simple step, because the brain is designed as this kind of machine for repeating behaviors over and over again. We're neurologically wired to repeat things. It's not easy to break that. But the only way is to apply light to it, to throw a light on it, and to bring some intelligence and to say, this is why I always get angry when an authority figure asks me to do something. This is why I'm so rebellious and I always say the wrong thing in meetings, and why it's constantly hurt me in my career. This is why I've made terrible choices in a spouse or an intimate partner over and over again. Now, that's like incredibly empowering. Now you have a little bit of space the next time you're about to make a decision to go, whoa, wait a minute. No, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I need a different type of person to be my partner in life. Or no, maybe I shouldn't say that thing to my boss. This has gotten me in trouble before. Now you have a little bit of power and you can start to build on that. So everything sort of revolves around your awareness of yourself and of these patterns.
Well, it sounded like you were talking about my life for a second there, Robert, because up until I was 40, I mean, I made a series of career choices based on money because I thought in my head that money would make me happy. And it took me literally, 20 some years to realize it didn't, which is why I started doing London Real. London Real was a 180-degree turn from that style of me as a greedy banker for 9 years and other jobs. And it was me finally realizing, after alcoholism, drug addiction, loneliness, depression, and just general, I'm not happy, to realize that the only way to get happy was, ultimately really to be of service. That's ultimately what I discovered. But I had to break that pattern. Actually, a meditation practice helped. Some drug addiction and overdose helped. Being alone helped. So a few things snapped and got me that realization. So
and maybe hitting bottom too.
Yeah, that definitely helps. And it was interesting, earlier you were talking about business leaders. I thought of that movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt, where this baseball team decides that if they want to win, if they really just wanted to win, they should take the emotions out of it and say, stop going for the super cool base hits and all these other things, and just play by the numbers. You can win this game of baseball if you just play it rationally and logically. as opposed to most teams that were doing things the old way and the old patterns because the old timers did it that way. And ultimately they were successful, I think, because they took their emotion out of it. Yeah.
Well, the only thing I'd say about that is I don't believe that emotions are bad. It's a misconception that people might derive from my book. And actually, the science on this confirms what I'm trying to say, that emotions are very important. That they've done studies of people who've had brain damage to the extent where the emotional part of the brain, which is generally centered on the right hemisphere, has been damaged. So people don't have access to the usual emotions. And they are the ones who make the most irrational decisions of all, because they can't, for instance, tell if someone who they should mistrust, they don't have the emotional intelligence to see that that person is not somebody they can trust, and then they do something very naive. So emotions are actually very important. And you're not going to be able to write a book, to start a business, to create a popular podcast, to win an election, unless you have a great deal of energy and emotional power and enthusiasm for it. I talk in Mastery how Albert Einstein, the person we consider the most rational person ever, was extremely emotional. And he talked about how it took an incredible amount of excitement to spend 10 years studying the same one formula day after day after day after day. You need your emotions. And I compare it to the old ancient Greek metaphor of a rider on a horse. So the horse represents your animal nature, your emotions, right? And the rider is your intelligence, the neocortex, the part of our thinking process that evolved much later on. Okay? So if you just let the horse go wherever and you don't try and guide it, you're going to end up in all kinds of dangerous things. The horse might just like jump off a cliff or will end up going anywhere, right? But if you hold on to the horse too tightly, if you're so worried about controlling it, it won't go anywhere, or it'll be very rebellious and upset. So that you have to learn how to ride a horse, which means you find a middle path. You hold the reins, you guide it, but you use that energy of the horse, the power that it contains, to take you somewhere, but you guide it. You give it some intelligence. That is what rationality is about. So you have to have that energy. You can't repress your emotions. You can't repress anger. To try and repress anger will only cause other problems, physical and emotional. You have to learn how to use your anger. You have to be able to be like that rider on the horse and guide it in an intelligent, productive way, right? So it's not about just getting rid of emotions, which is impossible for a human being. It's about learning how to recognize their power, how much they intend to infect your decisions, and to be able to guide them in some way instead of letting the emotions ride you, you're riding them.
You know, you mentioned getting in touch with your anger, and you got a great chapter in the book about your dark side and the shadow. And again, a few years ago, we made a movie here at London Real about one of my mentors. And my mentor is, I mean, he's like a Bond villain. He's like 75 years old. He's got a castle in Scotland, ex-oil man, climate denier, cusses like a sailor. He's a high-performance coach that's created $1 trillion worth of net worth. It's his way or the highway. And he's had a big effect on me. And we were trying to think of a way to present him to the world. He's also one of my most popular guests ever, Robert, but nobody admits it, but they watch him on the sly because he reminds them of their grandfather that doesn't accept their BS, right? And so in the beginning of the movie, we present him by saying, we just open up and we got all these like Faustian images and we talk about how everyone has a dark side because it's easy to point at him and say, well, I'm not like him. But I'm trying to get everyone to kind of admit they have a dark side. It's a big part of your book here, and maybe you can talk about how we have to accept, because most people won't accept that they do evil things, they do angry things, that they're, potentially savage, violent, nasty, mean, envious creatures. How do we get in touch with this, Robert?
Well, there are 18 chapters in the book, 18 laws, but the law number one, which is implied in the book, is the fact that we deny our own nature. We don't want to admit it. So it's always the other person that's a narcissist. It's always the other person who's violent and aggressive. But me, no, I'm not. I'm a saint. It's always the other person who's the conformist. No, I always get my ideas from myself. I don't listen to other people. It's always the other people who are envious. No, I never compare. It's bullshit. The person who denies it the most, the person who says most vehemently that I am not a narcissist is the most narcissistic person of all, because they have to prove how different they are from other people. It's all about themselves, right? So denial, as Freud said, is merely a way of disguising the opposite, which you're trying to disguise from yourself. Okay, so we have a dark side. I try and make the point in the book, we are all narcissistic and self-absorbed by nature. We all have aggressive impulses by nature. We are designed as animals to feel envy. So stop trying to play the saint and admit that you have these same tendencies. And the dark side is a chapter the shadow, in which I try and explain where the dark side comes from. And I explain that in childhood, if you've ever had children or been around children, you know, or you remember your own childhood, children are kind of these complete individuals. They feel a very wide range of emotions. Some of the emotions are positive, like love and affection and empathy, but a lot of the emotions are negative: anger, destructiveness, hatred, violence, etc. And children haven't yet been socialized. They have these complete range of emotions, right? They're like a total, like a round ball of energy that just exists, and they can't control it. They just are who they are, good and bad, angel and demon, all in one. But then as you get older, as you become 6 or 7 years old, you just have to listen to your parents and your teachers tell you, you can't be like that little Bobby or Susie or whatever. I'm sorry about my bad names here. You have to learn to get along with other people. You can't be so angry. You can't be so violent. You can't be so aggressive. You need to control it. And you on and on, year after year after year after year after hearing this, you push it down, and that round ball of energy starts becoming this squash little thing like that. And all of the dark energy gets pushed down in somewhere else. But it doesn't disappear, because nothing that's a natural human energy. You can't get rid of it. It's there. It's just repressed and pushed down into what's called your shadow, what Carl Jung called the shadow side of the personality. And the shadow will come out later in life, when you're in your 20s, for instance, when you suddenly have a burst of anger and you tell somebody something that you regret the next day, and you go, what the hell came over me? Was that somebody else? That wasn't me. I don't understand it. Or you buy something that was totally wrong, that was not the right purchase for you, and the next day you go, why did I buy that thing? Why did I spend $40,000 on a new car when I don't even have that? Blah blah blah. When suddenly you have some sort of behavior that surprises you, as if it came out of nowhere. You leave your very good wife you've been married to for 20 years for some sexy model who's 20 years old, and she ruins your life, and you're such an irrational. Why did I do that? Who was that person that came out? Well, that is your shadow side that you've repressed. It's coming out in moments that you can't control. So oftentimes you see that with celebrities who get caught in the act of doing something kind of naughty or bad, and they'll always come out in public and they'll say, that wasn't me. That isn't who I am. No, that is exactly who you are. That is exactly who you are. That is more you than the kind of saintly person you try and present. It's that dark side that is really a part of you that came out, that you've been trying to conceal from other people. Okay? So the thing is, you have to admit that you have a dark side, that you have aggressive impulses, that you have some antisocial impulses, that you have a rebellious streak, which is natural for all of us. We all went through a rebellious phase in our teens, etc. That you have these qualities that you kind of don't like in other people, but you have them as well, right? And the point is not to just suddenly become this devilish person in life and just give full rein to all that stuff, but to be aware, back to awareness, and to be able to channel it in a productive manner. So, for instance, I deal a lot of consulting with athletes, for instance, who have problems with power, etc. And they're the type of people who have, a lot of them, like basketball players, and I'm sure it's the same in football in the UK, they have a lot of aggressive, competitive, ambitious energy, right? And this is one area where you can now channel that dark energy into something productive by putting it into your team, by becoming a better player, by winning in competitions. So you can channel your aggressive impulses into making the best business ever and putting that competitive energy into something that benefits society by creating a killer product of some sort, right? So you can channel it into pro-social ways, in fact. If you learn, and I often tell artists, people who are filmmakers or writers, your anger is your best weapon of all. I know when I wrote the 48 Laws of Power, which has been my most successful book, we've sold well over 2 million in the United States. I don't mean to brag, but I'm just saying. Um, yeah, I'm bragging. That's my dark side. I'm going to stop that. Um, is I had a lot of anger, right? I had worked in Hollywood and I hated the falseness in Hollywood. I hated all the phony, yeah, I love your screenplay, blah, blah, all the bullshit. And I channeled my anger into that book. And people feel it. They like the anger. So if you're an artist, don't be afraid of your own anger or your own dislikes or even your violent energy. Put it into your work because people are so repressed out there and so politically correct. They're going to love it. They're going to love that you express some of those emotions that everyone else is afraid to express, and you put it in a work of art. So find ways to use that dark energy that are actually productive.
Yeah, that's super good advice. Did you watch the Michael Jordan documentary on Netflix? Because you really see his competitiveness, and then you're talking to him, 25 years later, and he's still mad at some of the guys he competed against. But he did channel that into, the team winning, but it feels like he keeps the energy with him. I don't know. What did you see in Michael Jordan?
Yeah, he's a classic example of that. And, he was like in high school and somebody told him, like a coach, you're never going to be a successful basketball player. You're too undisciplined. I don't remember what it was. He never forgot what that guy said. He remembered it every single day of his life, still does. He used that to channel himself, fuck you, I'm going to show you that you're wrong, etc. Anytime somebody doubted him or wanted to show him up on a court, he never forgot it. He used it to get back at them. And in some ways, he wasn't often the best teammate. He can be really hard on players. Fortunately, he had a coach, one of the great geniuses, strategic geniuses, in Phil Jackson. And I talked earlier about leadership and how it's important that somebody can set the right tone. And Jackson set the tone as team first. And he made it very clear to Michael Jordan, look, what you want to do is win championships. That's the ultimate. In order to win championships, you need a team. In order to have a team, you need to be a team player. And you need to not just be a team player, you need to be the team leader. You need to set the tone. And without Phil Jackson, I don't know how many championships he would have won. But he is a classic example of what we say. The other person is Kobe Bryant, who is my particular idol because I'm from Los Angeles and I'm a diehard Laker fan, and God bless his soul. He unfortunately was taken from us. But Kobe was the most intense. He was Michael Jordan. I can't say more than Michael Jordan because nobody ever has been that way. And even Tiger Woods to some extent. So it can be a little bit destructive. You can go a little bit too far in that if you don't have some degree of control of that energy, and it can spill out into your private life. But athletes like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant are the prime exemplars of this. The thing is, we don't have, you and I or people in business, we don't have the same outlet where we can physically impose ourselves on other people and be a little bit violent and push them and get the ball and score points, etc. We have to be a little more polite and social and civilized out in our offices. We have to pretend, we have to wear these kind of courtier masks, etc. But you can channel it in some ways, like for me, for instance, I'm a very ambitious person. I'm very competitive. Anyone who's ever played a game with me knows that there's a Michael Jordan in me. I'm not as bad as Michael Jordan, but I'm definitely of that type. I don't like to lose, right? So when I'm writing my next book, I'm always worried that it's going to fail, that no one's going to read it. It's going to be terrible. And I put so much energy and so much time into making sure that it's going to be a bestseller by trying to think of my audience and thinking how I can make this the best book. I pour all of my ambition and my aggression into that book, into making it something I can be proud of.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.